Hello everybody and welcome to the United Stand. The chart show is back and it's the hardest one we've done so far this season because United had a very mixed week. Newcastle 0-0, some good performances, some below par performances, and then Spurs, our best result under Erik ten Hag. So many good performances. So it's going to be a really interesting one. Who will be the big movers from last week? Obviously last week I think Casemiro was number one. But the interesting thing is there's two people who were in the top 10 last week who are not in the top 10 this week for very different reasons. I'll tell you who they are. Christian Eriksen is not in the top 10 this week because he didn't play. Last week's number 4 was Cristiano Ronaldo. He's not in the top 10 because he stormed off. So no Ronaldo, who was last week's number 4. So we've got 2 new entries coming in this week. Can you guess who they're going to be before I get to them? But let's get straight into it. This week's number 10 is in fact last week's number 10, Luke Shaw. And it's interesting because this is how it should be. This is how I imagine it is at clubs like Liverpool and Man City, especially when if they did do a chart show. I mean, let's be honest, no one's going to watch it for Man City. No one watches any of their content. But if they did do a top 10, imagine what it's like for Man City, where they've probably got 14, 15 players playing well every week. And this is what we want at Man United. Number 10 is a good position to be in a top 10 if the team is all playing well. So Luke Shaw holding on to number 10, it's not a bad place to be when the team has played well. It's highly competitive. Luke Shaw has played well this week. I think his Spurs performance was much better than his Newcastle performance, but he's played well. But doesn't justify a move up the charts because there are others who've done better than him, and that just sets the standard high. If you know Luke or anybody else, if you want to move higher, you got to do better, even though you're doing very, very well. And I'm glad that Luke Shaw's back in the team. I've always been a big fan of his, and he's been very, very good at left back this last week or so. And but I think he can be better. I think he can add assists. I think he can do more. So good week for Luke Shaw, but there are it's competitive, and that's probably the interesting for Marcus Rashford, because Marcus Rashford was actually last week's number 5. He's dropped 4 places to this week's number 9. And he's not actually done bad as our number 9. So our number 9 on the pitch is number 9 this week in the chart show, and he's dropped 4 places. Some people will be absolutely flabbergasted by that, but I said it is a hard week to do it. There are some weird movers because so many people did so well. So why is Marcus Rashford dropped? Because there were some better performances than him, even though he played well. Why didn't he hold on to his place? I think Rashford could easily have been in the top 5 this week if he'd scored the goals he probably should have done and maybe did deserve. I think against Newcastle, he didn't even start the game, did he? He came off the bench. He was benched against Newcastle. So big chance at the end, missed it, should have scored it. We would have got 3 points. Against Spurs, it didn't matter so much, but he did miss big chances. Some of those chances were generated by his intelligent runs, but the finishing wasn't quite there. So, look, as I said with Luke Shaw, Rashford shouldn't be bothered about being number 9 in the chart show this week. I think he knows why he's not higher. He didn't score the goals he probably should have done. But if he adds those goals to his game, he's going to fly up the charts a lot higher. So a good week for Rashford. Number 9 is no bad thing, considering all the people who are going to be ahead of him. I think it's going to make it very understandable. And another player who I think probably, me personally, I wanted to put him a lot higher is this week's number 8, Antony, which is actually a drop from last week's number 7. I think Antony, the weird thing is, Antony's this week's number 8. I think he had his best game for Manchester United against Spurs. We saw an element to Antony's game, which I know is there, which many people know is there from watching him play for Ajax. We haven't really seen it in a United shirt. We've seen the goals. I think what we saw against Spurs was the ability to run past players, the speed on the ball, the directness, the dribbling skills. And I think Antony actually had his best game for United on Wednesday night. And yet he is this week's number 8 because there were so many performances that sort of superseded that. So again, like Rashford, I don't think Antony's had a bad week at all. In fact, I think he's had his best performance for United, but he is this week's number 8. But I'm very excited to see, not only with him and Rashford and Shaw as well, but I'm very excited to see how Antony develops now, because I think the way that he's settled at United and the way that Ten Hag has implemented him to United, it's been that gradual thing, hasn't it? He scored those goals, which instantly meant that people can't start go. Because I'll tell you for free, if Antony hadn't scored a goal for Man United by now, people would be calling him an £80 million flop. The goals stopped those headlines, but actually the goals sort of masked the fact that he was basically just doing okay. The goals helped him, obviously. But as I said, I think he's gradually growing into the shirt and he's gradually getting better by the game, and that's a great sign. So this week's number 8 is Anthony. And as I said, I feel that Spurs was his best performance in a Man United shirt so far. First brand new entry. Some people might say, what's he doing in the top 10? Some people might say he probably deserves to be higher. I think number 7 as a brand new entry for Fred is spot on. Absolutely terrible against Newcastle. Rubbish. Absolutely rubbish. I think people gave him 3 out of 10 in that game. And remember, the chart show is based across the 2 games here. We're not just going, Spurs was fantastic, you're in the top, this week's number 1. You've got to look at both games, and that's why certain people are higher than others, because they did well over 2 games. Fred was rubbish against Newcastle, and that's being kind. Against Spurs, I think he was the catalyst to what we did. I think that Fred allowed us to really pin Spurs high up the pitch with a proper press. Some people don't know how to interpret what a press is. They think a press is when your forward runs around a lot. That's not what a press is. A press is when your team presses. Liverpool have been the masters of this for years under Klopp. You know, their centre-backs are on the halfway line. Their full-backs are almost like wingers. Their midfielders are like forwards. And you just absolutely suffocate a team. So all they can do is basically boot the ball back to you long and you get the ball back. Or even better, you win the ball high up the pitch. Fred was absolutely integral to that press on Wednesday night, and quite rightly was a consideration for man of the match. I think Casemiro actually was voted man of the match on our player ratings, but Fred was certainly in the top 3 players on the performance on Spurs. And so good was that performance that people are actually saying that Eriksen should stay on the bench for the Chelsea game. So a very good week for Fred, and he is this week's number 7. I can't put him any higher because the Newcastle performance was so low for me. But yeah, this week's number 7 and was fantastic against Spurs. This week's number 6 is Delot. I feel that Delot, again, was brilliant against Spurs. Absolutely brilliant. And I thought he was steady against Newcastle. And I think he's had a bit of a difficult couple of weeks prior to those 2 games where he's definitely been overplayed. And I think the fatigue and the early season form sort of caught up with him, and maybe he just sort of dropped into being a bit average. But certainly against Spurs, he was fantastic, and I thought he was reasonably good against Newcastle as well, considering we got clean sheets in both of those games. And let's not forget that in the case of Delot, he played Thursday night against Ammonia, he played Sunday against Newcastle, and he played Wednesday against Chelsea, Spurs, and no doubt he will start against Chelsea. So 4 90-minute games in 9 days? It's a ridiculous amount of football that Delot's having to play at the moment with no right back fit to even share the load with him or give him a rest. So I think Delot last week was last week's number 8. He moves up to this week's number 6. And another brand new entry. Surprising, he wasn't in the top 10 last week because he hadn't played. Obviously, he had a bit of a rest. Rafael Varane is back into the team. He didn't play against Ammonia last week, did he? And I don't think he played against Everton. I think he came on very late, so he didn't even make the top 10 last week. This week he's been back. He's played both games. We've kept clean sheets again. It's no coincidence. Martinez and Varane are the centre-back partnership, the best centre-back partnership I think we've had at the club in probably 10 years. They're immaculate. They complement each other so well. We're so much better when Varane's in the team and playing with Martinez. And I thought that against Spurs, I was massively impressed. A lot of people noticed how Kane was dealt with by Martinez, but it was the same with Son. And, you know, Son's a fantastic player. Varane dealt with Son. Martinez dealt with Kane. There was a bit of swap over at times. But that was the platform that allowed the team to press high, let's be honest. You know, you cannot press that high if your defensive line is deep. It was a fantastic performance from Varane. And it's been brilliant to have him back this week. And it's no coincidence to me that we've kept a clean sheet in both of those games as well. So this week's number 5 is a brand new entry for Varane, who had a couple of games off. He's back in, and he's back into the top 5. Mr. Consistent, Mr. Fantastic, and let's hope he can stay Mr. Fit, because we really do need Varane. He makes such a difference. And, you know, I'm recording this before the Chelsea game. But I think he'll make a massive difference in that as well. I forgot to say at the start of the show, by the way, I am wearing the Christmas jumper. You can pre-order this Christmas jumper through the link in the description. We're taking pre-orders because obviously we do ship worldwide, and we want to get them out and shipped in early November. So if you want to order one, get in now. A lot of them are getting ordered, and we've only got so many you can get. So make sure you get your orders in early. Links in the description. They are fantastic. They are knitted. These are fantastic Christmas jumpers. Basically, the symbolism is the 20 times. 20 Premier League, 13 Premier League trophies and 7 old Division 1 trophies who are on the bottom row. You get all 20, a number 20 on the back, a knitted jumper. It's fantastic, and we do ship worldwide, so make sure you get your pre-orders in. Varane is this week's number 5. This week's number 4, and he's actually dropped a spot because last week he was number 3. And again, doesn't really make much sense that De Gea drops a spot, but it does when you consider we've had so many good performances this week. I think there's 3 players who deserve to be above De Gea, so he drops a spot, but not through bad performance. I think actually De Gea against Newcastle wasn't as good as he was against Everton, and wasn't as good as he was against Spurs. But I thought he was all right against Newcastle, kept a clean sheet. His performance against Spurs was brilliant. It was as good as the Everton performance. I mean, there's been 2 performances for me this season from De Gea that have been fantastic. The Everton performance away from home, raining, horrible conditions, distribution was brilliant. And I thought, is that going to be a one-off? Against Spurs at Old Trafford, again, brilliant. Long ball, on point. Short pass, on point. Off his line, on point. We talk about the need for a modern goalkeeper. De Gea sort of showed us that against Spurs again. So for me, number 4, I just hope that De Gea can keep this up, because there has been conversations about buying a goalkeeper. There's even been conversations about Dean Henderson. No, De Gea on that form could be our goalkeeper for the next 4 years if he can do it. That's the question. How long can he keep this up? Because the development in his game and the improvement on his game from the last couple of years under Solskjaer is different. And I don't think people realise this. A manager that can coach a player will make a player better. We've seen it with Delo, we've seen it with other players, and we've seen it with De Gea. And also, a manager that's asking his goalkeeper to pass out from the back and come out of his box is very different to a manager that's saying, don't come out of your box and don't pass out from the back. And I think it was very obvious that Solskjaer wasn't even a good enough coach to ask De Gea to pass out from the back, let alone coach him to do it. And we're seeing with that with Ten Hag. So I hope De Gea can keep this up, because our back line has been so fundamental to everything that we've done in recent weeks. New entry, our second new... No, he's not his new entry, actually. He was in the chart last week. He was last week's number 9. He moves up 6 places, and I think it's his first time in the top 5. It might not be, but it's certainly his first time in the top 3 this season. And it is Bruno Fernandes. Even now, I still think people might not be happy about that, because Bruno has been quite a divisive player. I've given Bruno pelters over the last 6 months, because to me, he's one of my favourite players. And I think sometimes in life, you are harsher on the ones that you care about the most. And I know that Bruno Fernandes is a consistent, fantastic player, but he's been ridiculously inconsistent in the last 6 months. In fact, I think every game before the Spurs game, his highest player rating was 6. He's just been very average, I think. But against Spurs, he was fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. Newcastle, I thought he was okay. But Spurs, I thought he was brilliant. Absolutely brilliant in that game. And he deserves his place at number 3, because it's been difficult. And a lot of it's been on him. I think he's underperformed. He's been pretty average. We need to see that Wednesday night Bruno Fernandes week in, week out, because when he first came to the club, that's what he did. He scored, he assisted, and he was consistent. And we've missed that Bruno for a long time. I'm hoping that he is now going to be one of those players that, like De Gea, like Delo, is liberated by the coaching of a manager that wants to develop him, which he hasn't had for the last couple of years. So let's hope that this is the first of many. I mean, look, Bruno Fernandes should be pushing for number 1 every week. He's that good. Let's hope that that is what we're going to see from Bruno, and let's hope that he can take it into the Chelsea game as well, and over the next few weeks ahead of the World Cup, because Bruno Fernandes is the sort of player that should be playing well every week, in my opinion, and I think in everyone else's opinion. So deservedly, this week's number 3, which means we're approaching number 1. Last week's number 2 is This week's number 2, it's Lisandro Martinez, the butcher. Pat, 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 pat. He can't be moved. He's the man that can't be moved. No, I mean, look, I think Martinez... I mean, I looked at it. He was last week's number 2. I think he's been pretty much the most consistent player in the chart show so far this season that's been in the top 2. He's previously been number 1. I looked at that and I thought, not quite. Is he done enough to be number 1? Has anybody done enough to dislodge him at number 2? And I thought, you know what? I think Varane's had a good week. Bruno's had a good week. De Gea's had a good week. But realistically, I can't drop Martinez for number 2. I think that, you know, I do not think that Martinez is better than Varane. I don't. I actually think in the arguments, Varane's arguably better than Martinez. But the thing that keeps impressing me about Martinez is that this is his first season in the Premier League. This is his first couple of months in the Premier League. And he also got ridiculed by people who should have known better, who looked at how big he was and basically exposed themselves as people who don't know anything about this player, who haven't watched him play for Ajax and have just gone, he's small, he'll fail in the Premier League. The sort of opinion that belongs in the 1980s is still being spouted by ex-players who are paid good money to sit in front of millions on national TV, and really their opinion isn't worth the bloody matchstick box it's written on. It's nonsense, absolute nonsense. So that's always in my mind when I think about Martinez, is the fact that he sort of got written off before he kicked a ball because nobody had researched him. And also that he is playing for a massive football club and it's his first few games in the Premier League and he's so consistent and he's such a leader and he's got a great mentality. And there's no doubt that Harry Kane's one of the best strikers the Premier League's ever had. And Martinez, they sort of went 2v2 as well. It was sort of like a hark back to the Rio and Vidic days where the centre-backs say, you do your job, leave us with the 2 strikers, we're fine. I mean, this just wouldn't happen over the last 10 years. Can you imagine Lindelof and Maguire saying to Shaw and Delot, you go forward, don't worry about us, leave us with Kane and Son? It'd be a recipe for an annihilation. But yeah, Martinez absolutely dominated Harry Kane on Wednesday night. And I thought that Martinez and Varane played very well against Newcastle as well. So Martinez is this week's number 2. Which means this week's number 1, and he's the first player, I think, this season, correct me if I'm wrong, to retain the number 1 spot for 2 weeks. Casemiro. Casemiro is this week's number 1. He was your man of the match against Spurs in a pool of many. He was man of the match. And again, I think that the Newcastle game was very disappointing, but the centre-backs and Casemiro played very well against Newcastle. They did their job. Their job is not to score the winning goal. They were defensively sound, they kept the clean sheets, and they kept the ball moving. So I think that Casemiro and Varane and Martinez, for me, were the 3 players that came out of the Newcastle game with their heads held high as having played well. And again, they both played very well in the Spurs game, which was very much about how we attacked. They still provided that platform. I mean, Spurs just didn't attack us. They just, every time they tried to get near us, we just pushed them away. And Casemiro has been so fundamental to this. The contrast between Casemiro and a McTominay or Casemiro and a Fred in that holding role is just so different. The amount of times he's on the ball, the way that he shields the back 4 and picks up the midfield runners, it's so different to have a specialist CDM. And we've been crying out for this for years. I think I'll never understand why Solskjaer just ignored the CDM role. I mean, he ignored a lot of things like coaching and, you know, attacking football, but to not buy a centre defensive midfielder and spend massive money on right backs and centre backs and forwards and not bother to buy a CDM. It's the justification that I keep talking about, whether you're listening to an ex-player expert on the TV or you're listening to a manager that's managing Manchester United. Don't ever put your own opinion down, because how many times over the last 10 years have we sat and said the manager's got this completely wrong, and lo and behold they're out of a job because they didn't do that. The fact that we haven't bought a CDM for 3 years is ridiculous. The fact that we've now bought one and he's consistently one of our best players just shows that all of you going on about a CDM for the last few years are absolutely spot on. And sometimes football's so simple and we fall down because we've got clowns in the circus running the club. I mean, how can a CEO, a director of football, a manager, an assistant coach and everybody else over the last few years not realise we need to go and buy a CDM? It's embarrassing. But we've finally done it. Ten Hag did it in his first summer, surprise, surprise, and the team is benefiting for it. And he's a massive player. I mean, this is why I go into games quite confident now, because all right, we might have an attack like Newcastle that's firing blanks, but we won't concede silly goals at the other end. And I think last season we had an attack that was firing blanks, but the defence was, you know, an open door. This season, that's a shut door. It's locked. And it means that even if we do waste chances, we're still going to get a point like we did against Newcastle. And if we do take 1 or 2 chances, we'll win. So, yeah, Casemiro, fantastic again. 2 weeks at number 1. And the only thing I would say, because everything's been very positive, and I'll keep saying it, I'm still baffled why it took so long for Casemiro to get in the first team. Because I still don't think Casemiro is at 100%. I still think he's adjusting. I still think there's the odd stray pass. There's still the odd tackle mistimed. I still don't think he's totally adjusted to the Premier League, but he's fantastic, absolutely fantastic, and he deserves to be this week's number 1 again. So make sure you smash a like on the video. It's match day, of course, so very excited to see Manchester United playing against Chelsea. We'll have the road trip for you this afternoon as well. And do not forget to pre-order your Christmas jumpers. They are available. They are going fast. Get your order in. We do ship worldwide. The United Stand, first ever knitted Christmas jumper. And I don't really want to take mine off. It's just a lovely fit. It's weighted well. It keeps you nice and snug. And the design is elite. But I can't wear it outside yet. People will think I'm an idiot. But you can get your orders in. Links in the description. And I'll speak to you all later for the watch along. Thanks for watching.